Almost like clockwork, they just keep coming. The highly publicized incidents connecting Black victims and police officers with guns. And every time, racial disparities in policing become part of the conversation. But rarely do we take time to dive into the roots and solutions of the issue. I'm a civil rights attorney and co-founder with my husband, Brian, of an organization that trains educators to work with at-risk student populations. We develop culturally responsive teaching programs, and this is a challenge that is always on our radar.
And today we have two special guests who can help us to deepen the discussion. Returning to BK Live is Monifa Akinwole-Bandele, a blogger, human rights activist, and community engagement consultant with Communities United for Police Reform. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we want to welcome Jason D. Williamson, a senior staff attorney with the Criminal Law Reform Project of the American Civil Liberties Union and an adjunct professor at NYU School of Law. Thank you for being here. And we're just going to jump right into it. And I'm going to start with you, Monifa. And it seems like every month we're looking at another issue of conflict between the police departments and Black communities. And my first question for you is this happening more frequently? Or is this just something that with the use of cell phones and technology we're just seeing more of? Can you give us some insight into that?
Yes, absolutely. It's the latter. When we in the Malcolm X grassroots movement started our Cop Watch program back in the 90s, we were seeing and hearing of all these types of incidents, from Anthony Baez being choked to death, very similar to what happened to Eric Garner, from Amadou Diallo being shot unarmed, very similar to what we are seeing recently. But the difference is now is that we have all this video footage, and we're able to have a conversation in social media and push these stories out in a way that we couldn't in the 90s, or in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s for that matter. And so we're seeing a growth of awareness, and there's more tools that people have to discuss these incidents.
And you know, what's interesting is that one of the things we're finding is that the racial disparities persist even under regimes or administrations that are actually attempting police reform. If you look, for example, at what's happening with stop and frisk here in New York, which has actually been in the news a lot lately as a result of it coming up in some of the most recent the presidential debate. But even if we look at stop and frisk, an area that has been under some level of policing reform, we know that at its height in 2011, over 600,000 New Yorkers were stopped by the police. And I like to always add 80% of those were completely innocent at the time they were being stopped. But of that 600,000+ people, 54% of the people who stopped were African American, 30+% were Latino. You fast forward to the year 2015, and we see stops drop off precipitously from over 600,000 to under 25,000 stops. And yet, within that 25,000 stops, 54% of the people who stopped were Black, 30+% were Latino. So we're looking at, regardless of what type of regime we're operating under, African descendant people are still bearing the brunt of racism within the confines of policing. And so, Jason, one of the things we often like to do is look at a Sankofa analysis, really that principle from West Africa that says you have to look to your past in order to understand your present so that you can build adequately for the future. Yeah. In light of that history, can you explain a bit how the history of racism in this society impacts what we see happening between police and Black communities today?
Absolutely, and thank you guys for continuing this conversation. It's unfortunate that you know we're talking about it under these circumstances, but I appreciate the fact that the dialogue is happening. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think one of the things that people need to understand is that the criminal justice system in this country is really inextricably connected to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in the United States, and you know this is not an accident. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also includes a gaping loophole that says that involuntary servitude and slavery is illegal except as punishment for a crime. Right. And so the folks who were on the short end of the stick when slavery was abolished and you know, suffered all sorts of economic and social losses, took full advantage of that loophole and enacted laws that were designed specifically to criminalize Black people and particularly Black men. And so you had laws like vagrancy and disorderly conduct, loitering, these sorts of things, laws that are still on the books today that allowed police officers to arrest and imprison Black men who were then used or basically leased to the highest bidder to provide the same sort of free labor that they were providing under slavery.
Now, I just want to pause there for just a minute because I think that is a huge part of the conversation that we don't often get to dive into. So when you have this 13th Amendment, which says no slavery except if you're convicted of a crime, after the passage of the 13th Amendment, you have the introduction of these new rules and regulations called the Black Codes. Black Codes which were modeled on the slave codes, and the slave codes were those rules that determined how Black and white people would interact with each other. What level of volume could you speak at? How frivolous could your conversation be in the presence of white people? How nervous could you make white people with the way you gesture and hold your body? And so with those being those new rules that we see coming into play after the Emancipation Proclamation, how does that connect to what we now understand to be convict leasing?
Well, I think there's still a level of misunderstanding and apprehension with respect to Black people, Black men, and so on. And so, we're living right now in what is starting to approach a police state, and particularly in certain areas of certain cities in urban America. And so, I think that this is a continuum. And if you don't understand where we started, then there's no way that we can figure out how to get out of this hole that we're in. And as I said, the fact that we're having a dialogue about this and hopefully, forcing people to think about things that are uncomfortable to think about, that will lead to progress. That's the goal.
I wanted to just add briefly, too, even before the Civil War, the origins of policing were rooted in preserving white supremacy. Some of the first police forces that you saw in the Americas in New England was the Indian constable. So it was specifically to police Indian communities that were situated around the settlers. In St. Louis, which was like the New Western Front, same thing. Those constables were specifically, their main charge was to patrol Native Americans who were in the vicinity of these Western settlers. And then in the South, their main job as police forces, the patty rollers, was to maintain and enforce slavery, to catch runaway slaves, to control Black and brown bodies, and to preserve white supremacy. So your first police forces had that as their main charge. And so if you don't understand that, then you don't understand what's going on now.
Right.
One of my heroes, the Honorable Marcus Garvey, he has a quote. He says that people without knowledge of their history are like trees with no roots. So I think this is really important to talk about, because in a lot of these conversations, people don't know that history. So they think that it's something new, and you have to be intentional about breaking the cycle if you want to break that cycle. There is a book that I want to reference. It's called Slavery by Another Name, and it's by a scholar named Douglas Blackman. And it really deals with how Blacks were re-enslaved after the Civil War all the way through World War II as a result of convict leasing and all of these deals that were made with slave owners. And he argues that the neo-slavery, what he calls neo-slavery, was actually in many ways worse than slavery. During slavery, you had an interest in keeping your slaves alive and clothing them, and remnants of the family staying together. But now that you can criminalize people anytime you want, you started to see the life expectancy was lower. The conditions, a lot of those that were re-enslaved, the re-enslaved are not having, are not healthy. And he argues that it's actually worse. So I think that kind of brings us to our next question. How does the war on drugs, if you fast forward through Jim Crow, we know about slavery. Let's fast forward to the war on drugs. Michelle Alexander has a book, The New Jim Crow, and one of the things that she says is that we were, adults of African descent, we have more of us who are under criminal justice control right now than there were enslaved in 1850. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about the war on drugs and how that plays into this policing.
Yeah, absolutely. The war, our parents always said the war on drugs was a war on us. Like, we've heard those types of sayings before. And that's because when you use something and you only apply it to a certain community, basically racial profiling, you're just basically using it as a tool to criminalize. When you look back at those early vagrancy laws, a lot of people didn't have jobs, right? But the law itself was only applied to Black bodies that didn't have jobs. And so now drug use, we know, is more popular. More white people use drugs in the United States than Black people. But the enforcement of the drug laws specifically target Black people. So it's just like these vagrancy laws. So it's become a tool to continue that war on us. It's a tool of profit. There's profit made in prisons. We know we have a huge private prison industry, and it was a profit to enslave black bodies back during, of course, during slavery, but even after slavery. So this war on drugs, one, drives a profit to certain individuals, a certain, you know, the 1% have you, but it also uses, it's that next tool, really, to criminalize black bodies. And I just want to raise it just yesterday in response to the shooting of Keith Scott, where many eyewitnesses were saying that he was unarmed, that he was not being aggressive towards police, which of course, even if he was, doesn't mean he should have been shot and killed. But now it's that they found marijuana. Like this is is the police response to the community demanding justice.
Right.
So again, using drugs as a tool to criminalize black people when white people use drugs and white people even use more drugs.
And one thing I think is important for us to remember, the experience that black people and people of color in this country have with police is obviously very different than the experience that other folks have, and that's part of why it's important for all of those folks to understand how we got here. But I think the drug war piece offers a perfect example. Right now, we're seeing conversations about the heroin epidemic in New England, right, and in predominantly white states, and now all of a sudden it is a public health issue that shouldn't be dealt with by law enforcement. And of course we know that when the crack epidemic hit black communities back in the 80s and early 90s, there was no such conversation happening. And so policing in black communities has really become a form of social control versus policing in, you know, white suburbs where people really do view the police as public servants and people that they can trust and count on and so forth. You know, I see a police officer and I walk in the other direction.
Even as an attorney who
absolutely,
is right.
right.
I think one of the things that you guys have outlined is this constant thread that we see from the time immemorial, really, as it pertains to the founding of this country, in that policing for black and brown communities has always been about preserving the social order between races and maintaining a space where white supremacy could thrive. In light of that, and recognizing that those elements are still with us, when we think about solutions, right, when we think about where we put our precious energy, which is already being taxed in so many ways as we respond to incident after incident, how should we apply this history and this analysis to our understanding of even the types of solutions we should be thinking about implementing to these issues?
Yeah, our solutions have to be informed by that history. We have to push back on this rush to create friendlier police and community relationships. We have to push back on this rush to have barbecues between community members and police members, because
ice cream won't solve the problem?
Ice cream's not going to solve the problem. We need justice and accountability, right? And so with that, and you can't have that unless there's community power.
Right.
So we have to really focus in on how do we build power? How do we gain transparency? How do we gain accountability? Body cams are a great idea, but it actually traumatizes us more than anything else. I have 2 children, and the idea that they have to watch Eric Garner take his last breath over and over on a video clip versus when we were younger with Anthony Baez, we just were hearing about it and imagining it is like an additional trauma. So we know what's going on. We've got to focus on things like the Right to Know Act. There's things federally. There's sentencing and correction reform legislation to get rid of mandatory minimums, most of which are targeted at nonviolent drug offenders, mostly black people. A lot of women and mothers are tied up in that. And roll back this prison industry. And really focus in on building power in the communities so that we can continue to hold police officers accountable. Because ultimately, any laws that we put on the books, if we allow them to be applied disproportionately, the racial profiling continues.
Right. Do you want any final words?
I agree 100%. The only thing I would add is, to the extent that, you know, law enforcement is going to continue to play some role in our communities, there needs to be a dramatic shift in the culture of those police departments, because, you know, just like changing the laws doesn't necessarily make a difference if they're selectively enforced, providing training and all sorts of resources to police departments, or making sure that there's more diversity in police departments, goes nowhere if the culture inside of that police department is encouraging this kind of behavior.
Yeah, and we've got to imagine a future without policing. And I think if we have that as an ultimate goal, then we keep going on the right track.
Well, we want to thank you both. We're out of time, but we really appreciate you providing some light in this complicated issue. We appreciate it.